Hi all, welcome back to environmental science. This time out, we're going to talk about some more population ecology. We're going to talk about demography today, which is really just the study of statistics or population statistics, like is the population growing, is it shrinking, what's the different age groups, those kind of things. Okay, so to get into it, demography is the statistical study of populations and measuring characteristics of populations, like how populations will change in the future. So this can be important for lots of things, especially when we're talking about environmental science and we're talking about effects of humans on the environment or effects of humans on different species. If we can figure out maybe what an endangered or threatened species population is doing over time, are they shrinking, are they growing, then we can make predictive or have predictive measures to figure out, well, how much habitat are they going to need in the future? Is that population becoming more endangered, or is that population recovering? These kind of things. Okay? And so it's pretty basic, and we've talked about this before when we talked about how populations grow. Remember, we said there are kind of two ways at which a population can grow. We have exponential growth, where you have kind of a doubling of the population over time. And then eventually that would reach a carrying capacity and turn into logistic growth. And remember that we said that the rate of growth of a population is based on a couple things: the number of births and deaths, or the death rate and the birth rate, and the rate of immigration and the rate of emigration. So how many individuals are immigrating into the population and how many individuals are leaving the population, okay, immigrating out of the population. Okay. So normally we're interested in closed populations where there's not any immigration or emigration. Then we're really interested in just the birth and death rate. If births outnumber deaths, then the population's increasing. If deaths outnumber births, then the population is sinking or shrinking. That's pretty basic. But along with that, it gets to be a lot more complex, because we need to talk about, well, what role does sex play? What role does age play? And then even further than that, is there competition? Is there delayed maturity based on population size? So in a lot of species, what will happen is, as the population grows, there's less resources, so individuals in the population may delay maturation until they get to a certain size so they can compete, which changes your birth rate, death rate numbers, and your population will actually decline or shrink for a little while, and then maybe explode after all those individuals reach maturation, or after the conditions in the environment become better and they can compete with one another. Okay? And we'll look at some examples of this as we progress, some from humans, but some from outside of Homo sapien. Okay, so let's talk about cohorts. And cohorts are a group of individuals that are the same age. Sometimes, if aging an organism is not possible or is difficult, then the cohort is not based on age, but rather based on size. So for some organisms, we might say between 30 millimeters and 100 millimeters is this cohort. 100 and 200 is this cohort. And 200 and 300 is this cohort. Okay? And that's a size cohort. And typically that is based on age, but we might not know the individual's age. Or maybe they have very different life cycles or life history traits when they're 30 to 100 100 to 200, 200 to 300. Maybe they change. Okay, maybe they're going through maturation periods. Maybe they're moving through the environment. Maybe they're changing food resources. These things. Okay, so cohorts normally are based on age, but sometimes you'll see. We'll talk about a cohort being a size grouping. Okay, and so when we look at cohorts, we can characterize them not just by their age, but what's going on in that cohort. Maybe young cohorts have low fecundity, but also low mortality. Okay? Maybe as they age, they have higher fecundity, but with that, you have an increase in mortality. Okay? So if you're a male and you're searching for females, and in order to entice a female to mate with you, you have bright colors and things like that, that increases your mortality. Okay, that increases your death rate. But at the same time, your fecundity or birth rate, or how many offspring you're going to produce, increases. Okay, so fecundity is the birth rate, mortality is the death rate, and yes, males, we can calculate their fecundity. Even though they're not giving birth or producing eggs, males still have a fecundity number that is associated with them, and often that's related to how much sperm they produce, and what's the fertilization rate and those kind of things. Okay, it gets complicated for some species, but fecundity and mortality. And then importantly, when we're looking at demography of a population, the number of individuals in each cohort, it really represents the age structure. So this is important because let's say a population has lots of young individuals, but very few old individuals. But your mortality rate is pretty consistent. Then it means, whatever the distance is from young to old, okay, it means however many years that is. Maybe it's 4 years. It means that in 4 years, you're going to have a huge population of old individuals. Okay? And it's a kind of a predictive model. And so it allows us to figure out what's the age structure for the future based on what's currently going on in the environment. Okay? Along the same lines is knowing the sex ratio. Are males to females, is it equal? What's the proportion of males to females? Is it a 1-to-2 ratio? For every one male produced, you have 2 females? Is it, a 1-to-1 ratio? This is important. Sometimes this is based on births of different number of males to females. Some species have a different proportion of males to females at birth. Some species have the ability to change this, to alter this. Things like some turtles have temperature determinate sex. Okay, crocodiles, alligators, some snakes, some lizards. There are other species. Some species of fish have this. Okay, and so that means the temperature of the eggs that the eggs are incubated in determines the sex of the individuals. And so there are known situations where populations can have a higher proportion of males because of temperature changes in the environment, or a lower proportion of males because of temperature changes in the environment. And so you can have environmental driven sex ratios or even behavioral driven sex ratios, like how long maybe a crocodile lays on the nest and heats the nest might determine how many males or females are produced. Okay. So normally though, when we're talking about birth rates, it's based on a more chromosomal, not temperature-based sex ratio, and it's just the number of females that are born compared to the number of males that are born. Age distribution, we already talked about this. Okay, so how many organisms at different ages in the environment, if the age is able, if we're able to age the organism. Sometimes, again, like I said at the very beginning, sometimes age is replaced with size. Okay, because we're classifying, sometimes we just classify as based on size, and it's not based on age, because age might be difficult to get at in the environment. Important again, because this directly relates to how fast your population can grow, or if your population is shrinking. If you have a bunch of old individuals that are not reproducing any longer, or reproduce very little, and it's heavily skewed towards one sex, maybe your population is declining. If you have a bunch of individuals, lots of individuals that have not reached maturation yet, then your population is probably not growing. And so the ratio, the sex ratio and the age distribution are very important to whether or not your population is growing or declining. Okay, based on this, we can start to generate these models or these distributions that are based on characteristics of organisms. Now, these are just hypothetical characteristics. Not all species fit survivorship curves perfectly, but normally we can kind of stick different types of organisms into different survivorship curves. A survivorship curve is really just a way to predict what's going to happen at different stages of a species life. So early on, are you going to have a high amount of mortality? Or are you going to have a high amount of survivability? And then how does that compare as time goes by? Okay? And there are really three survivorship curves, or three types of curves. Okay, so you have a type 1 where you have the highest mortality is at the oldest individuals. Okay, so that means your mortality rate for young is very low, and then as they age, they'll get to a certain age, like a maximum age for that species, and then they'll start to crash. Their mortality is really high. Type 2 is your mortality rate is relatively similar year after year after year. Okay? And so you have a pretty similar mortality risk. And type 3, high mortality for young individuals, and then the mortality becomes consistent or stable after you get out of being like a juvenile or young individual. Really, those are the three curves, and we can kind of think about organisms that would fit in these different curves, okay? Different survivorship curves. Okay, humans is a good example of something like a type 1 curve. And normally we talk about organisms that have high levels of parental care, organisms that have very few offspring, have a type 1 curve. So things that might just have a single baby, like a blue whale. Okay, its survivorship from a very young age is pretty stable. It's pretty high chance of surviving. And then once you get to old age, all those organisms are going to, their mortality rate increases as you get to old age. For humans, so you can see, like, if about 75% of the maximum life, and in this case, you could say that our maximum life is about 100 years, so about 75 years, humans start to tail off. Okay, other organisms have a type 2. Okay, pretty consistent. This is showing a hydra, which is like it's a group of Cnidarians, hydra are typically freshwater. They look like upside down jellyfish. But lots of organisms have type 2 kind of situation where they produce a moderate amount of offspring, and they have basically a consistent death rate or mortality rate. Birds have kind of a type 2, so if we put a robin on here, maybe a robin produces 4 eggs. Maybe early on, maybe only 3 of those make it. Okay, and then maybe one dies, okay, at about 25% of their life, and then maybe one dies, around 65% of their life, and then one makes it to the maximum life. So lots of birds fit a type 2. They produce a moderate amount of offspring at a given shot, and their mortality rate is fairly consistent. And then in the case of marine organisms, for a lot of marine organisms, type 3 is definitely the type that the survivorship curve that they would fit. They produce thousands, if not millions, of offspring. Most of them do not make it. Most of them become food for other things. And then if they do make it, they get to this certain size or certain age, and they withstand mortality for a long time. So oysters, crabs, octopi, all kinds of things are fit kind of a type 3 curve where maybe most of your offspring are going to die, but then once a few of them make it, they have a pretty high survivor rate until they meet their maximum life. Okay. Excuse me. All right, so let's continue talking just a little bit about communities. Communities refer to really the species, all the species that occur in a given locality. Okay, we talked about this a little bit before. The community itself, it's a term that gets used broadly for lots of different things, but in biological terms, we're talking about all the species. And rarely do we actually look at all the species, but really that's what community means. So if we, say something like the Salish Sea community, we're talking about everything, all the species that occur there, the plants, the animals, the bacteria, the protozoans, everything, the archaea, all of those species that occur in that given region. Okay? Now, often we will classify a community based on some organism that might be in the community. We talked about this in the beginning when we talked about redwood forest communities. Guys, so they're called a redwood forest community because the dominant species of the redwood is a redwood tree. And so sometimes we characterize it by that, like a specific organism or a specific set of species. Okay? But sometimes we organize it by the classification of, say, a pyramid, an energetic pyramid, okay? Or things that interact with each other. Okay? And so maybe we classify communities based on, what kind of predation is there, competition, mutualism, and how does that relate to energy or nutrient cycles. Okay, so if the community itself is got a name just because of the locality, often we're classifying it based on energetics or nutrient cycles within the system, but taking into account predation, competition, mutualism, commensalism, how do species interact with each other within the environment. So for example, if we say the Tanzanian savanna community, Okay, this is a locale. It's not after a dominant species. Okay, so there's not a dominant plant species or really a dominant predator species that the community is named after. Instead, it's a locale. So then we can look at all the different situations. You can have competition for food resources for the primary producers. Okay, so you have all these plants, then they're doing photosynthesis, and then you have all these primary consumers that are eating those plants. They're competing with each other for plant resources. They might also be competing with each other for water resources. Okay, so the community itself, at that bottom level, we might talk about that piece of the community. Okay, at the top level, we might be talking about this predator-prey reaction. How many, top predators, apex predators, can the community fit, or can the community hold? Okay, it's going to be based on how many primary consumers or secondary consumers you have, and then how many primary producers you have. What kind of energetics do you have? Remember the 10% rule that we talked about before, that only 10% of the energy moves from plant to primary consumer, then 10% of that energy moves to the secondary consumer, 10% of that would move to the tertiary consumer, etc., etc., etc. Because a lot of that energy is lost as heat, especially when we're dealing with things like mammals, endotherms. But just in general, it's deal with, a lot of that energy is with heat or the behavior of the organism. Okay? So the organism walking around, moving around, it's burning energy. That energy is not lost, but it is lost to the environment. Okay, that energy is not used to fuel this organism. That energy is already gone. Okay, and then we can finally talk about, in a community, we can talk about, the mutualism that we might have. Okay, so you can see here, you have a giraffe with, other primates that are near a water hole. Okay, and then on the back of the giraffe, you have these birds. Okay, I can't tell what they are, but there is a species of bird that lives typically on giraffes called oxpecker, and that's probably what these are. But at any rate, they are feeding off of insects that might be associated with the giraffe. The giraffe is benefiting from the primates being at the watering hole, because the primates, this is called the many eyes hypothesis. So the primates will be looking around, for predators. The giraffe is looking around for predators. And the more eyes you have on the landscape for predators, the better you will be at kind of avoiding predators. And so the primates will call if there's a predator in the region. The giraffe knows that, recognizes that call from the primates as a distress call or a warning call, and the giraffe reacts to it. It's not that the giraffe speaks per se primate, but it understands that when these organisms get agitated because there's a predator, they need to react to that predator also. Okay, so we'll stop there and we'll continue community next time out.